Christine. Go ahead and bring up your slides.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to tee up a project that Aaron and I have been assisting on with the national labs, and it's looking at the electric vehicle supply equipment policies, about the ownership, the operation, and how they're funded by regulated electric utilities to identify emerging trends and best practices. They looked at a number of different factors, models, and strategies to evaluate what's out there and do a nice job of surveying what's out there, and also what some of the common trends are and challenges as well. And I will pass it off to Aaron to introduce the National Labs team.
Thank you so much, Al. And I just want to say thank you so much to Christine and the teams at the National Labs. This has been a really fabulous project to be able to help advise on. I'm really excited that you're all here to share the work with the state working group. Without further ado, we've got Christine Holland from the Pacific Northwest National Lab. She's an economist in the Energy Policy and Economics Group and is a leader in the TE space and has worked on many a strategic plan that involves light-duty, medium, and heavy-duty electric vehicles. Next, we have Jason Ball, who is a policy researcher in the Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Division with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where a lot of his work has focused on kind of energy regulation and economic policy in support of a transition to a cleaner and more dynamic energy system. We also have with us Wilfried Kabre, an energy economist at PNNL, who evaluates energy resilience, climate resilience, and energy markets and policy. And last but not least, we have Brittany Tarufelli, a senior energy economist at PNNL, who focuses on the impact on the techno-economic, regulatory, and policy impacts of achieving a resilient and affordable electric grid. So again, thank you all very much for your work on this, and we're excited to hear from you. And I'll pass it on to Christine.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Al, for the introduction to our project. So not to duplicate, but it was just, we did a deep dive into electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE, ownership models and lessons learned. And we believe we've looked at a good representative sample to hopefully give you some best practices and approaches to developing future EVSE policy. So I just gave you a little project overview on top of Al's. And then next, Jason's going to talk about the landscape of reviewed policies. As I mentioned, we wanted to get a good representative sample. We weren't able to look at every state, but we did look at several states. Then we're going to do a deep dive into 3 topics: evaluation and reporting requirements, stakeholder coordination, and then economic considerations. And prior to that, I'll cover the slide format, which we talk about metrics, trends, and best practices. So all of the categorical groups, evaluation and reporting, stakeholder coordination, and economic considerations, they all follow that same pattern of metrics, trends, and best practices. I would like to point out that best practices may not necessarily lead to one policy that we think is good for all states. Actually, that was rarely the case, that we were able to find one policy that was ubiquitous or would cover all states. Instead, we kind of focused on practices, or even in some cases considerations, that you may want to think about when you're developing EVSE policy. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Jason so we can talk about the policies that were reviewed.
Thank you, Christine. I'm going to kick off the discussion by just looking at the background and the utility landscape that we looked at. We conducted a pretty comprehensive review, but it was basically just a sample. So it was 64 distinct utility-owned EVSE programs across 15 states. We covered all the major regions. We call this the core set of data that we looked at. So some of the slides you're about to see in some areas of the report actually went beyond these 64 programs, but every part looked at least at this core set of data. And that's because it gave us a really broad look at the primary models and regulatory drivers that were in play for all of these programs. Interestingly, about 97% of these programs that we looked at were all approved, either fully or with conditions. And this really signals to us that regulators are broadly supportive of these kinds of utility investments, provided that they have clear guardrails. And we're going to talk about that in a second. There's also about 60% of these programs are still active, which really tells us that the market is still very much in its early pilot stage. Next slide. So what are the utilities actually doing in the programs we looked at? There's a clear split in ownership strategy. The first is the turnkey model, which accounts for about 44 of the programs. This is where the utility owns and operates everything. It's often it's often justified as some kind of like strategic intervention to address market failures. So for instance, Potomac Electric used it to jumpstart a network in multi-unit dwellings, the turnkey model, specifically because the private sector just wouldn't invest in those kinds of units. It does present a regulatory challenge, though, which is managing anti-competitive risk. You got to make sure that the ratepayer-backed utility investments don't end up crowding out private companies. On the other hand, about 9 of the programs we looked at were make-ready models. This is where the utility installs the electrical infrastructure up to a stub, but the private entity owns and operates the actual charger. This kind of model is explicitly designed to be to be able to enable market development by slashing upfront costs. So SCE's Charge Ready program, for example, covered about 70% of the initial infrastructure costs in their area, which is great for competition because it really reduces those barriers to entry, but it creates a financial risk from stranded assets where utilities and ratepayers are stuck with the infrastructure if the private operator ever fails. And then there's the portfolio approach, which is doing both of these things at the same time within the same program. And about 11 programs we looked at did that. Next slide. So what's driving these programs? Why are they being created? Well, nearly 2/3 of these programs are the result of direct policy mandates, either legislative statutes or proactive commission regulation. And about 30% of the programs stemmed from utility settlements as a result of broader rate cases, not necessarily because they filed something specific on EVSE. What this really indicates is that there's a strong interest by policymakers in creating utility programs that align with either state established or PUC established goals and objectives. So that's what's driving the creation of these things, and then that's what's ultimately leading to those two key types we just discussed. Next slide. Strategies. So this is how are these programs being structured at a data set level. We saw 3 big pieces come out of looking at these 64 programs. The first is pilot to program. 80% of the programs that are in this data set are pilots. That's deliberate. Regulators aren't just testing technology. They are running large-scale data collection efforts to validate the cost assumptions that go into these programs and establish some kind of utilization rate before committing to a permanent rate design or a permanent kind of cost recovery. The second is formal stakeholder collaboration. This was seen in about 3/4 of the programs where some kind of formal process that acts as a pre-litigation settlement mechanism where utilities, private providers, and advocates can really hash out the technical disputes before they turn to lengthy, contentious regulatory battles. And then the last one is targeted market interventions. We're seeing a lot of utilities focus ownership on filling specific gaps, which is hard to reach communities where private business cases just are weak and won't work. This kind of strategic focus lets the utility act as a market enabler, and it ensures access, which may or may not be a state level goal. It remains a key element of the overall program. So that's the data set that we went into. Now we're going to go into more detailed pieces.
Thank you, Jason. So next we have Wilfried. Before that, I just want to review the slide format that you're going to see for these different categorical topics. First, we start with metrics, which just introduces the topics being discussed. And then the trends just kind of gives the landscape for that particular category. And then last, as I mentioned, we'll provide best practices, which may not be one particular policy, but so sorry. But either considerations or practices, we may bring up a particular policy that is a best practice. Okay. And so now we move on to Wilfried and evaluation and reporting requirements. Is it Wilfried? No, sorry, Jason, you're next.
I was about to say, okay, good. I thought I prepared wrong. Okay. Metrics and evaluation reporting. So this is where we're kind of really leaning into oversight and accountability. This is opening up the black box of utility data, if you will. Reporting requirements are basically a main tool regulators can use to ensure that ratepayer funds are actually linked to state policy goals. Now, that accountability really relies heavily on the data that is requested. There is no single correct metric. It depends entirely on the state and what goals it has set, either at the PUC or the legislative level. The consistent trend that we are seeing, though, is that it's moving away from simple, how many charges did we build kind of metrics towards outcome-based metrics. This is things like grid utilization rates, cost per port, deployment percentages that target specific communities. The metrics that are chosen really are directly reflecting the public policy outcomes the PUCs are looking for as they approve these programs. Next slide. So what are the trends in the data handling based upon those metrics? The first one is reporting cadence. Most programs seem to require at least annually or semi-annual reporting. Some require even more frequent reporting, like quarterlies. And some also extend the obligations years after the pilot closes to capture some kind of like the long-term usage data. The second trend is standardization of data. This is a governance issue, which is in states like California. Templates are a mandatory across all utilities because it enables comparability. When every utility files a unique report, it places a huge administrative burden on the commission staff to be able to compare between those reports, because it's much more difficult when they don't look alike or don't present the same sets of data. The third one is advanced metering and interval data. These are requirements for like 15-minute or hourly data. I really can't emphasize how important this part is becoming and will continue to be, because high resolution data is essential. Without it, you can't really show that EV load is being shifted to off-peak times, or if it's unintentionally creating new local distribution peaks. It's a foundational element of most rate making and of future demand response programs. The last trend is third-party evaluation and customer metrics. So some states require utilities to dedicate a budget to a neutral evaluator. These kind of external reviews add a layer of objectivity and credibility, and take some level of work, or not work, but they reduce the level of effort and burden that's placed on commission staff to have to look at these kinds of evaluations. The tracking deployment in certain communities via metrics is also ensures that the infrastructure count is verifiable. So those customer metrics are really linked to that evaluation piece, because you need to be able to actually verify the data that's coming in and that it's meeting the goals that were set up when the program was established or when the pilot was established. Next slide. So how does this constitute best practices? What were the things that we saw in this data set? The number one, standardized reporting processes. Have a common template and a data dictionary across the utilities. This gives a high quality, actionable data set that allows for quick comparisons between service territories, between utilities, and over time. The second one is successful evaluation really seems to require some level of metrics that are specific to the goals that are being established. For grid optimization, this means mandated interval data for affordability. It means tracking cost to end user and some kind of demographic penetration data. But transparency there exposes where the program is working and where it's not. Number three is just oversight and transparency. It really adds a level of rigor and legitimacy to these kinds of programs, and it prevents, the utility from grading its own homework, as it were, and really ensures that the lessons learned actually inform the next generation of these kinds of programs and the next generation of infrastructure planning. That's all I have for this section.
Great, thank you, Jason. So now we move on to Brittany and stakeholder coordination.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Next slide, thank you. So with stakeholder coordination, our objective or overview is that we acknowledge that navigating complex regulatory requirements for infrastructure development requires stakeholders and utilities to coordinate with the utility commissions or other oversight bodies. And robust stakeholder processes are a key enabler for beneficial and cost-effective EVSE deployment. So in this section, we examined EVSE policies and programs across the United States to examine trends in stakeholder coordination processes and identify best practices. So in this section, our best practices were identified from key policy frameworks or requirements that encourage active stakeholder coordination. Best practices were evaluated from several dimensions. We used a case study approach where we evaluated metrics like, does a state require a robust stakeholder process? Does a state engage their stakeholders? And how does stakeholder engagement impact a state's EVSE policies and programs? Next slide, please. So some key overarching trends from our review were first that states use stakeholder engagement frameworks to advance their transportation system. They were driven by key themes such as aligning strategies with state transportation goals, addressing market barriers, and optimizing public and system-wide benefits. Second, these frameworks align stakeholder engagement with broader policy objectives, and they were pivotal to allowing stakeholders to identify and mitigate potential barriers to EV deployment. And third, by prioritizing stakeholder engagement, states delivered widespread benefits. These included things such as improved grid utilization, strategic deployment of EVSE, and cost-saving opportunities, either for ratepayers, utility systems, or the environment. And last, to implement these frameworks, states had different approaches and strategies. So some held public workshops or panels, others established working groups or committees, some solicited feedback during public comment periods or on draft straw proposals or white papers. But a consistent theme across all of these is that these approaches formalize that stakeholder input. And these frameworks also tended to be iterative. So that helped to sustain that stakeholder engagement through regular reviews, evaluations, or updates. And additionally, we did see a lot of outreach and education initiatives were used, and that was to enhance public awareness and encourage widespread EV and EVSE adoption. And so I did want to mention that while stakeholder coordination was generally carried out by the states, some programs did require utilities, especially in the form of outreach or education or technical assistance. And in some cases, also requiring program proposals were vetted with stakeholders before filing with the PUC. Next slide, please. With this slide, I wanted to provide a few specific examples of state regulatory commissions that developed these frameworks with defined stakeholder engagement. So I just highlighted a few states here: Maryland, Minnesota, New York, and California on the left-hand side of the slide, but we do have more examples in our report. So one that I wanted to touch on was Maryland, where the Public Service Commission developed an EV working group in coordination with other state agencies and utilities to address these EV adoption-related issues and implement a coordinated statewide EV portfolio. The working group engaged stakeholders through a variety of means, so structured proceedings, hearings, requests for stakeholder comments. And to give you a sense of the cadence of that stakeholder involvement, proceedings included semi-annual reporting, mid-course evaluations, and final reviews. And throughout the entire process, stakeholders were given opportunities to submit comments and incorporate their concerns and ideas into program development. Another example that I wanted to highlight from the left-hand side of the slide is in California, where the California Public Utility Commission developed a long-term transportation policy framework. And that framework required several touch points for stakeholder engagement. It included stakeholder feedback in the development of a program handbook and an annual roundtable as a venue for stakeholder input and review of data. And so in this framework, touch points can be held on an as-needed basis, but the CPUC does require that annual roundtable that I just mentioned as a point and a venue for stakeholder input. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, I have some examples of enabling stakeholder input from program design through reporting. And I have a couple examples listed here from New York and California, but again, I do have more, and we do have more examples in the paper. So just to highlight the example from New York fostered programmatic stakeholder input from the development of working groups, meetings facilitated by the working groups, enabling comments on straw proposals and presentations that were then used to identify and address immediate and long-term actions to support EV market growth, and ensure that utilities had an EV readiness framework that positioned those utilities to meet future EV market needs. Next slide. So last, to summarize, I wanted to highlight some best practices that we observed. So first was that developing an overarching EVSE policy or framework to define that stakeholder engagement allows for robust pathways for stakeholders to be involved. Second, fostering programmatic stakeholder involvement from initially through program design, through reporting, helps to bring that stakeholder input in on standards and best practices for EVSE deployment. Third, engaging stakeholders early and often, including in the vetting of proposals even before they go to the commission for review, can reduce some barriers to adoption of that EVSE infrastructure. Fourth, engaging stakeholders throughout the process to allow for targeted outreach and to identify unique challenges and community-specific needs can help ensure that greater adoption of EVs and EVSE infrastructure. And finally, that stakeholder input may lead to more cost-efficient approaches and optimized rate designs. And we just have here too a quick point that on the flip side, insufficient stakeholder engagement may result in some missed opportunities and result in reduced grid efficiency, limited utility benefits, slower EV adoption, and unaddressed barriers to EVSE deployment. So all of those are good reasons to get those stakeholder frameworks in place. And with that, that's all I have on stakeholder coordination, and I'll turn it back over to Christine.
Thank you, Brittany. Next, we move on to economics. And as you saw, there were 3 subcategories. And you may actually see a little bit of overlap in topics. And we were fine with this because when it comes to why, who, and how programs are funded, we realized that you may want multiple perspectives, and it requires a lot of research and thought behind economic policies. So that's why we have those 3 different categories. And now I'm going to move it on to Wilfried, who's talking about economic criteria for program engagement. Yes, Aaron.
Before we move on to the next section, I did want to see if we could have a moment if there's any clarifying questions on the previous section before we hop on in.
Sure.
Sorry to break up your flow.
That's fine.
If anybody has any, either feel free to raise your hand, put them in the chat. Happy to call on you. Otherwise, I've broken up your flow for no reason, and we'll let you get back to it.
No, thank you. That's perfect. I should have been asking after each section. Yes, if you have any questions, chime in at any time. Okay. Wilfried, I'll turn it over to you.
All right.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. Sorry, I need to clear my throat. So yeah, thank you so much, Christine. So in this section, I'm mainly going to discuss the economic justifications that commissioners at the public utility commissions as well as public service commissions have utilized to justify the participation of utilities in the deployment of EVSEs and in their ownership in some instances. So to be able to really identify the justifications that were used by commissioners, we had to look at programs in a lot of states. And it turns out that for the most part, we could group those justifications into 5 elements. From a review order to another, the vocabulary may change, but in essence, a lot of them really meant the same thing. So we group them into these 5 elements. And the first thing that was usually brought up was whether the programs that utility presented was going to help to address market gaps. The second thing was, were they going to help bridge financial barriers and de-risk the investments for the private sector? The third thing was did it incorporate anti-competitive prevention measures such that, if the utilities were to slip into some monopoly activities, the commissioners were able to call them back to order. The fourth thing was compliance with law. And I will discuss that a little bit more in the next slide. And the last thing was a promotion of cost effectiveness and smart grid integration of electric vehicles and their accompanying charging infrastructure. And this list here is not following any particular order. These are just the main elements that we found that commissioners brought up, when they were reviewing utilities' proposed programs to decide whether they would allow them to, get involved and own some of these chargers in certain cases. And from one review order to another, different justifications elements were used. In certain cases, all of the 5s were discussed, but in some other cases, only a few of them were brought up. So next slide. So here, I would like to discuss the trend in usage of the different justification factors that are presented in the previous slide. And before I begin, I wanted to say that the graph that you see on the right hand really represents the frequency at which these justification factors were brought up in the cases that we have evaluated. So we've looked at a sample that we thought were representative of another state. And we wanted to see how often these justification factors were brought up in the review process. And it turns out that addressing market gaps and financial barriers were really the most frequent ones. And if you review the literature of these utilities' ownership of EVSEs, you would see that it makes sense because for the most part, utilities are seen as these entities that can help bring chargers to these places that the private sector just won't to go because there is no financial incentives for them. And the other thing is utilities are also seen as the ones that can at least reduce the upfront investment cost for the private sector by taking care of the make-ready infrastructure in certain instances. So in 62% of the cases that we reviewed, these justifications were mentioned. And we've seen it, for example, in a case in California with Pacific Gas and Electric. And the next one here is compliance with law. So this is a case where a state law could be a House bill or a Senate bill, simply and clearly required the commissioners to ask the utilities to file for programs where they can install and own. For the most part, utilities have to argue, right, or present a case to commissioners and argue for the reasons why they're supposed to be allowed to own some of the chargers in certain instances. But there were also the cases where the law came from the state saying that, yes, allow the utilities to participate. And if they want to own the chargers in certain areas, go ahead and allow them. So this is not the most frequently used justification element, but it did appear in a couple of cases that we reviewed. And the following one is the cost effectiveness of smart grid integration of EVSEs. So this particular justification appeared a lot when it comes to authorizing pilot programs And the rationale was that, well, allowing utilities to own the chargers will allow them to have a better understanding of how they impact the distribution grid, so they can better integrate that to achieve, cost effectiveness and benefits for the entire ratepayer pool. And the last one here is the provision of anti-competitive measures. So this is a justification that utility commissioners have utilized when they were really faced with fierce opposition about concerns regarding monopolies. And for the most part, they say that, well, they have these legal grounds or legal provisions that allow them to quickly call back the utilities to order. So should they start to crowd out private investment in certain areas. So they felt confident, because of these provisions allowing the utilities to go ahead and, invest in the EVSEs and own them. And in certain instances, this provision here was manifested in, for example, a limited number of chargers that the utilities could own. So, so that the market can still remain competitive. So that being said, the landscape is really heterogeneous. There's not really a one size fit all. And that takes me to the next slide. So, which makes it really difficult to present a specific set of best practices, at least for this region, for this section. But for the most part, commissioners are really after the cost effectiveness of the programs, and protecting, the ratepayers. So what we could recommend is that the state clearly defines what, cost effectiveness means for the state. And the state of Illinois, for example, has done that, and a couple other states. So clearly define what that means, and also define the criteria for achieving those that cost effectiveness. So at least the utilities, all of them can really play, by the same rules. So yeah, that's all I had for this section. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilfried. So that was pretty meaty stuff. Do we have any questions for Wilfried? Okay, then we're gonna move on to rate and incentive design, and Jason's gonna lead this up.
Sorry, my button stopped working. Okay. Metrics and rate design. Let's talk about rates. I love rates. I'm a rates guy. I spent 10 years in Washington doing rates. So this is a part that's really close to my heart, and I have a lot of interest in this stuff. So I apologize if I talk too fast or go into way too much detail. This is where regulators adapt traditional rate making to manage the unique challenge of EV load growth. We're going to focus on 4 critical areas. The first is cost classification, then cost allocation, then we're going to go into load management, and finally, we're going to deal with everybody's favorite problem, which is demand charges. Next slide. Cost classification problem. So the first part of this is, how do you classify long-term EVSE investments for recovery? You can use a capitalization approach, which is you add it to rate base and then you create long-term financial stability for the utility, but also create long-term financial risk that is squarely allocated to the entire ratepayer class. Conversely, you can expense costs, which eliminates the incentive to overbuild, but risks creating this abrupt rate shock every year that you have to true up or create some kind of true up for the annual surcharges that come through. In Massachusetts, the way the DPU there solved this problem was they authorized National Grid to expense costs, but then simultaneously created a performance-based plan that encouraged some level of cost discipline to try and limit the ability for that rate shock to affect ratepayers. So that's one side of the problem for cost classification. The second side is lack of data, which is really a chicken or egg problem. You need historical data to properly classify costs, but that data only exists after a program is deployed and has been operating for some time. So how do you set rates when you don't have the data to set the rates? The pragmatic solution that we've observed here is the conditional approval of preliminary market-based rates. This is a strategy where it prioritizes getting the infrastructure deployed and the pilot programs working to collect the data, but with the explicit goal of transitioning to formal cost-based rates once the data set is robust. However, this creates trade-offs. One of them is it introduces the risk of market distortion, where utility-backed pricing ultimately crowds out private competitors because at the beginning, what is market-based rates may then transition to cost-based utility rates, which may no longer be commensurate. Okay, that's the first challenge. Next slide. Okay, the next challenge is issues in cost allocation. Who pays? The user pays model. This one seems on its face to be relatively fair. Its program costs are recovered only from the EV drivers who use the charging stations, but it can create prohibitively high prices for early adopters, which ultimately slows down the adoption, which is not what you want in these kinds of programs. Socialized cost model spreads the risk broadly, betting on the theory that managed EV load will create some level of system-wide benefit and improve fixed asset utilization, which puts up downward pressure on everyone's rates. But this risks creating a cross-subsidization problem where non-participants are now funding this program. And Christine, can you pull up the tables? So to manage this, there's a lot of specialized tools that are available that different commissions use in different ways. We summarize those in two ways. One is in accounting mechanisms, and the other is in allocation methods. You can see here we've listed them all out. The report goes into much more detail about how each one works, examples of how they work, and how they can solve some of these problems. Next slide. Okay. Managing load. The research that we pulled together and especially the core data set really confirms that passive management works really, really well. Simple time of use rates use price signals that encourage off-peak charging, and they are highly effective. They can shift upwards of 80 to 90% of the peak charging, and they're doing it without any real complexity or two-way communication, or direct, immediate two-way communication needed. So that's passive management. Active management, this is kind of like vehicle to grid technologies, is technically complex. It's still technically complex, and it only appeared in about 20% of the programs we looked at. It has a lot of really high long-term potential, but what we found in the programs that were using it is that it's really mostly effective when it's targeted strategically at high value use cases. This is things like commercial fleets, because the underlying technology is it's there, but it needs to mature and the costs need to come down in order for it to really become something that works broadly. And then the chart at the bottom here really shows shows this out in the data set we're looking at, where more than half of the programs are adopting default TOU, and only about say 20% are looking right now at active load management. There's a hand up.
Yes, Ben Baker with the Maryland PSC. On the active managed, you have vehicle to grid. Do you also include smart charge management, or maybe what I would call V1G, where it is active control, but still, but not two flow for this chart?
Yes, we included that in the report, and we discussed that a little bit. And it came away from we kind of came away with it with the same conclusion, which is everything that it produces, you can essentially recreate with default time of use.
That's helpful to know. Our utilities have been I share similar concerns. There's lots of studies out there that basically show if we scale up EV deployment, this thing could pay off. But at current EV levels, it's a debatable prospect, it feels like. Maybe that's what you're saying as well.
Yeah, I think that's a relatively safe conclusion to draw. And what we looked at, a sample set of programs across the country. So in what we looked at, I think that's a safe conclusion, but it may not necessarily be true in every area because there's a lot of other dynamics that go into that conversation. Things like population density, EV density, availability of charging networks, like all those things are going to also have an impact on that. So I would say it's something we're seeing as a broad trend, but it is definitely also something that is worth investigating, if
And
that makes sense.
I'd like to piggyback on that. PG&E, they have pilot programs for active management pertaining to flexible interconnection. That's highly managed, clearly. And it becomes cost effective when the hosting capacity is very tight, very constrained, in combination with fleet charging. So that's an example. And these are just piloted programs at this point. But there are some good examples out there where active management makes sense under those circumstances.
Thanks.
Next slide. Okay, demand charges. Everyone's favorite problem. DCFC usage is a high power but sporadic, and so this creates the charges on the demand side that can make up the majority of stations' operating costs. In one pilot we looked at, it was like 86% of the entire pilot's costs all came from demand side charges. So that really makes business cases really shaky on how to build these kinds of programs. There are two solutions that we kind of identified as being available. The first one is a physical fix. You pair the station with some kind of battery storage where you use the battery storage to kind of offset some of that demand level, either cost and can use it to arbitrage energy, or you use it to like build up a charge for later in the day. It has a high upfront capital cost, basically. That's the biggest limiting factor is these kinds of storage systems. They just cost a lot of money at the outset. The other thing that we really saw, and this was, I think, far more common, which is demand charge relief. It's very simple to implement because it's just a temporary rate-based solution that either limits or waives the demand charge. It creates this like non-cost based bridge that de-risks early market investment, but it then also deconnects the rates from the underlying cost drivers. So what that means is the long-term success of a rate-based solution really relies upon the long-term projections of the EV adoption and the charging behavior. And if those don't manifest, then you can create potentially large problems with those rates that were being either grandfathered in or just being put on a glide path. Next slide. Okay, best practices. So to summarize what the research we found looks at, the first one is employ a phased-based approach where use pilots to de-risk investment and pair capitalization with expensing, these kind of portfolio level approach, and use that to phase in cost-based rates after you get the data and you start with market-based rates. This allows this data-driven off-ramp to move you away from the temporary rates because you don't have the data towards the fixed rates that are cost-based because the utilization data is now available. The second one is prioritize simplicity and prioritize customer experience. This is really achieved when programs use strong yet simple kinds of signals like default time of use. The research that we looked at really found that sophisticated rates like SDG&E's VGI rate could confuse customers and really only achieved a marginal amount of additional load shifting. The last one, deploy advanced solutions strategically. This is just about addressing key market barriers. The first one is active load management is effective when it's targeted at high value, high utilization cases, and that treating demand charge relief as a surgical tool that's temporary, and it can support early fast charging markets, but it's best used as that de-risking tool during an initial low utilization phase towards a much broader, much more cost-based rate.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Any questions out there? Any other questions for Jason? Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this last section, funding mechanism, just piggybacks on what Wilfried and Jason already talked about. It's just one more perspective, like what some of the programs look like and how some of these are funded through specific programs. And Wilfried touched on the fact that, there's different motivating factors. It can be publicly driven, or it can be profit driven. If utilities own EVSE, there's the potential for making profits. So regulatory commissions need to look closely at the conditions under which utilities may own or fund EVSE projects. And there's two types of programs, broadly speaking. It's where the utilities subsidize third-party ownership of infrastructure, and those can be either through incentives or rebates, some of which are graduated by income. So residential programs may provide more funding for lower income individuals. They may provide low-cost loans or revolving loans for infrastructure, and they may provide, as you've heard in prior sections, make-ready costs, the infrastructure, in addition to the chargers themselves, or separate from the chargers themselves. And then, so there's the third-party ownership. Utilities may own the EVSE themselves. So both circumstances, third party or self-ownership, they'll need to get funding, either through rate recovery or some type of funding. And on the right of the slide, there's a spectrum, which you've already heard discussed. At the top, this is a circumstance where programs may be funded by non-EVSE owners only, such as the gas tax might fund some programs. And at the bottom of the spectrum are EV owners only through registration fees or special EVSE rates. And then somewhere in the middle, the more socialized view is everybody pays. And you heard circumstances of this in the prior slides. So here, this could be an earmark on state income tax or riders on electricity rates that apply to everybody. So those are just some examples. And now we're going to look at some trends for EVSE that's third party owned or operated. And from the subset of policies that I've looked at, this appears to be more common than straight ownership from utilities. At least 35 states that I've seen currently offer some EVSE incentives or rebates, and at least 64 utilities companies offer for all the foresaid customers. And in some circumstances, I'm seeing that there's also that demand response participation is piggybacked with these incentives and subsidies. So that's another trend that we're seeing. I already mentioned that some of these rebates are income graduated. Down below, the bottom left-hand box. Here is a policy that was approved by North Carolina for Duke Energy. And here was a circumstance where they wanted to avoid cross-subsidization. So they only had EVSE or program participants pay for the EVSE programs through special rate design. On the right side of the slide, I just want to give you some examples of third-party funding. Excel Energy, they have the public fast charging portfolio. This is a mixed ownership program for commercial fleets and workplace charging. And Excel covers make-ready costs up to the meter. And third-party owners covers the remaining costs for DCFC. For level 2 charging, Excel provides and charges monthly service fee to cover costs. Baltimore Gas and Electric, they offer up to 50% of L2 and DCFC charger costs. That was 2019 to 2021. I should have more examples. The report has numerous examples of utilities either partially or fully covering the charger cost or make-ready costs, or provide rebates in exchange for either a fixed fee or special rate designs. And then I also provided a couple non-utility examples because they oftentimes piggyback with utility subsidies. And Oregon Department of Transportation, they have piggybacking or complementary rates that where they rebate 75% of eligible costs for different chargers. And another example is Colorado Energy Office. They offer low-cost loans for residential and commercial installations that are in addition to what their state utilities are providing or may provide in addition to. And so I bring this up because it's important for states to realize the different funding pots and when budgets may potentially run low for particular programs if they're hoping to achieve particular state goals. And so that's why it's important to look at complementary funding efforts. Which brings me to my next point. So the first point I bring up here isn't as much a best practice as is it a consideration. And what we're seeing is that I had mentioned that gasoline tax earlier for states. Well, some of those revenue budget pots are becoming smaller because of fewer miles driven by internal combustion engine vehicles. And I'm seeing a couple circumstances because of that where states have started leaning towards EV registration fees to kind of make up the shortfall. And then also to the point, just echoing what Jason and Wilfried said, that is that states need to decide whether utility ownership will be publicly funded or just funded by EVSE by deciding, defining the EVSE itself, whether it's going to be a public good, how it impacts the state to help determine who's going to pay for it, whether it'll be all funders or simply potential users or owners of EVs. So again, this is another circumstance where there's no one particular best practice, but considerations that state regulators will need to think about. And so with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the DOE. And there are two participants for this research, Prophet Gavey and Betty Middlestad, who did a lot of legwork gathering information on the different policies that aren't here today, but did a lot of work. So I just wanted to recognize them for all their hard work and the great work by the other team members. And also our POCs, Al and Aaron, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Christine. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Christine, and to the whole team. As we kind of get into the, I think, kind of Q&A, a little bit of Q&A, there is a question in the chat for Jason. I'm happy to read it out. It's from Michelle Thatcher from the California PUC. It's asking, Jason, could you please elaborate on the confusion that customers report about more complex rates? In theory, the customer should just be responding to a rate signal. You know, if it's low, they charge. If it's high, then they don't charge, or if they can, they export.
Yeah, so when I say confusion around more complex rates, I'm talking about programs that have that are doing active load management. So we're talking about things that either have dynamic prices or are I think one of the ones we looked at was in New York, where it was they would send a signal not to charge through like an app, and they would send a signal that says this is going to be a high cost charging period for you, but there was two problems with it. The first one was the chargers they were using had a lot of outages, so it wouldn't pick up the signal that not to charge. And then the second one was people would get the signal and then they weren't sure if that meant they should charge or they shouldn't, because of it was the price that the signal that they received just was worded confusingly. So that's what I mean about confusion. Is it's not necessarily that complex rates themselves are confusing, it's just they have to be presented in a way that's not, and the technology has to be built in a way that doesn't make it more confusing for the customer. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the context.
And I'll just piggyback on that too. So yeah, I have heard of different customers being confused by the rate structures, and I'm trying to find it now, and I'll put it in the chat if I can, but there's somebody has a calculator where you can put in, if you know your typical charge amount for your home, it estimates the bill based on different rate design. So if I could find that, I'll put that in the chat.
Great, thank you. And I'm sorry if you guys don't mind, just a follow-up question. Was that more on the residential side, or were commercial customers also confused about this? Is there any distinction?
No, is there a distinction? I don't think that there is much of one. That program I was talking about was on the residential side. On the commercial side, there was a similar program with Duke, where I think they also had problems where with the charging infrastructure just wouldn't play ball with them, and I think it was due to manufacturing errors where the chargers that they had chosen didn't integrate well with the utility systems, and so they would try to program them to charge or not charge based upon certain signals, but then it would create, but the chargers themselves didn't respond to the signals very well. And so that was part of the problem. Is, you know, like on the commercial side, you try to automate these things, but then the technology just doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the more frequently you do like dynamic pricing, where you have, you know, very different price signals even at the hourly level, the more opportunity there is for that kind of system to start to break down.
Thank you very much, Jason. Kara, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, and I'll just add to the conversation. I think, especially when we're thinking, I'm from the Department of Energy, especially when we're thinking about, you know, either charger or auto manufacturers who are really looking at a nationwide market, you know, interacting with 3,000 different utilities and the different ways that they report their rates, or the extent to which they're machine readable does make it more difficult. I think when you're looking at a one-on-one basis, I can totally appreciate, you know, our signal is quite good, but when you're trying to look at it more holistically, that can be challenging. So.
Thank you, Kara. Are there any other kind of questions, comments, thoughts, concerns? Either I'm not seeing any in the chat, I'm not seeing any hands raised. I think I'll give another few moments here. Seeing and hearing none, I want to once again thank the entire team, Christine, Jason, Wilfried, Brittany, for your presentation. This was really, really important and really helpful work, and really appreciate it. And I'll pass it back to Danielle, I think.
Almost. There we go. Thank you all so much. I just wanted to add before our lab leads leave, trying to get there, that this project was part of the DOE-funded National Lab Technical Assistance Program for states. And so I wanted to encourage everybody in the EV working group to feel free, oh my goodness, to feel free to submit requests for technical assistance to the labs, because there is an active program. There we go. Because there is an active program that you can use and leverage that is intended specifically for answering these types of questions, not just holistically across a full scan of what's happening in the country, but also state-specific questions that you might have and that you might be struggling with related to EVs, demand growth, planning, all of these different topics, rate design, cost allocation. So feel free to grab the QR code or use the URL that's up there. And of course, that will be in our presentation that we post online afterwards. And thanks to DOE colleagues for funding that program and making sure that our members have access to those kinds of resources. So at this point, I'm going to say we can let our lab friends go. We're going to have